acute emergency of generalized tonic-clonic seizure 3 times in last 24 hours. So definitely this is emergency situation. So you can find a pallor and sign in her. You order some investigations which shows hypocalcemia, hypophosphatemia with elevated alkaline phosphatase. The PTH is also really elevated. Vitamin D is low. She also has anemia, most likely iron deficiency anemia because ferritin is low. Somebody went ahead, did a anti-TTG, which also came positive, suggesting clue towards celiac disease. So how will manage this patient in the emergency when she presents with GTCS?
IV calcium followed by oral calcium and cold calcium also. Then gluten-free diet later on.
Okay.
Celiac is confirmed.
Okay. Right. So why not oral calcium?
Status and IV status usually.
Yes, because he has a really emergency kind of situation which has aroused because of the hypocalcemia. So we'll try to rectify by giving IV calcium. I don't know. Are there any endocrinology resident here? सुधांशु एंडो से कोई है? कोई नहीं है. चलो. So if there is some endocrinology, I would have agreed like IV calcium, oral calcium plus calcitrol because here we want to actually rapidly elevate the serum calcium levels. So that would have also true. Okay. So similar patient, more chronic history over 1 year. She had 3 episodes of GTS in the past in the last 1 year. Just it is not an acute condition. Otherwise the situation same. So here I think like you said it is not acute emergency. One could go with the oral therapy like option 1. Right? So like we discussed, hypomagnesemia can be life-threatening. Similarly, a acute and severe hypocalcemia also can be life-threatening, which can lead to bronchospasm, laryngospasm, asystole, and sudden death. So one should not take these electrolyte abnormalities lightly. This is also quite common in the hospitalized patients, especially sick patients. And many times it is seen on routine testing of so many patients who follow in the OPD. So we really should know what should be the basic approach in such patients. Like magnesium, it has a critical role in the neuromuscular function and it is also important component of the mineral phase of the bone. This thing is quite important from the practical point of view. So I would like to spend some point. Almost half of the calcium are bound to albumin and half are physiologically active. This is called the ionized calcium. So this is the physiologically active calcium. So in certain circumstances where this physiology of binding to albumin is altered, especially in acutely sick illness or in setting of renal failure, one may consider doing ionized calcium, but that has to be a measured calcium. It should not be calculated. Just an important point, when you send ionized calcium, total calcium to the chemistry lab, whatever you get as ionized calcium, it is actually calculated by a formula. They just make it 50% and give it. It is not actually measured. So if you want to really know the ionized calcium, you send to a lab where it is actually measured by a equipment, by a machine. Because it is almost 50% bound to albumin. If you do a total calcium and if you do not measure the serum albumin, you won't get a true picture of body calcium. So whenever you send a total calcium, you should also send a albumin simultaneously. And you have to correct the serum total calcium if serum albumin levels are less than 4 gram per dl. So that is a vital aspect. I want all of you to understand this. And whenever you send a total calcium, please send a albumin. Similarly, sometimes we get extremely low level of calcium in an asymptomatic patient, and when we try to go back and find what is the error, we find that the sample was sent in EDTA vial. So if you send the sample in a EDTA vial or in a citrate vial, so those things will go and bind to the calcium and you will get a falsely low calcium. So always give clear-cut instructions to all the nursing staff, especially those joining new, to take the sample in an appropriate vial like the yellow vial or the red color vial, which are meant for the serum. So, like most of the electrolytes, they are predominantly absorbed in the proximal small intestine, and calcium also predominantly reabsorbed from the kidney. I am not going to discuss all these things. Rather than I want to highlight what are the basic physiological response to the setting of hypocalcemia. So when the calcium levels try to fall down in the body or falls, by a negative feedback mechanism, it instantly stimulates the parathyroid hormone secretion, which try to reabsorb more calcium in the proximal kidney tubules of the kidney. This PTH hormone also,
अच्छा
yes, is there any doubt? Okay, so the PTH does three actions. It directly reabsorbs calcium here in the kidney. It also increases the formation of active vitamin D. It stimulates the 1 alpha hydroxylase enzyme, which leads the 125. It leads the more formation of active vitamin D, which is 125 hydroxy vitamin D. This subsequently lead to more absorption of calcium from the GIT. It also directly leads to more resorption of the bone, so the more calcium is released to the circulation. So the first physiological response of hypocalcemia is it stimulates the parathyroid hormone secretion. Then this increased PTH will further lead to more phosphorus leak. So there will be more hypophosphatemia. So understanding this physiology is very basic. When you see a patient of hypocalcemia, then you decide what are the subsequent tests you order and what are the different permutation combination of those results which can lead to a diagnosis, which we will practically discuss towards end of this session. So coming to the common causes of hypocalcemia, it depends upon the setting. Like one sees the patient in OPD, general OPD, the most common causes will be related to lack of vitamin D. There may be malabsorption, there may be inadequate sunlight which leads to vitamin D deficiency, there may be problems in the liver, kidney, and anticonvulsant therapy which leads to excessive metabolism of vitamin D, or rarely maybe vitamin D deficient rickets. Rarely they may be because of certain genetic conditions. I am not going to discuss them. These are also quite rare conditions which are especially seen in endocrinology department. So I am not going to discuss those things. But the more common thing is hypomagnesemia, especially in hospitalized patients, where it can lead to hypocalcemia. Another setting where it is common in setting of chronic renal failure, where the conversion of the 25 hydroxylase vitamin D to 125 is impaired. So less amount of 125 vitamin D, which is active form, leads to inadequate absorption of the calcium from the GIT, so leading to hypocalcemia. Rarely in sick patient in the hospital setting, a sequestration of calcium can happen in the third space, such as in the rhabdomyolysis, pancreatitis, hungry bone syndrome, or tumor-lysis syndrome. So, the clinical features, just like hypomagnesemia discussed, they mostly related to increased neuromuscular excitability. They may present in form of perioral paresthesia, carpopedal spasm, tingling in the hands, muscle twitching. Once we examine, one may get a Trousseau sign or Prostek sign. There may be tetany. In severe patients, it may lead to laryngospasm, seizure, and cardiac arrhythmias. The ECG features, like we discussed, they may be prolonged QT interval. Again, they all these symptoms depend on the severity of hypocalcemia and more importantly, how rapidly it develops. For example, in a patient of primary hyperparathyroidism, what we do, once the source of excess PTH is taken out, and if there is extensive skeletal involvement, whatever the calcium in the circulation can mobilize to the bone. So it can lead to a rapid fall in serum calcium. So there a calcium level of 7.8, 7.7 may develop severe symptoms. But where a case of vitamin D deficiency which is untreated and left for months together, a calcium level of 7.2 may go as asymptomatic. So it is the absolute concentration of calcium and the rapidity of fall which determine the symptoms. So here I will show one slide how to elicit the Prostek sign. So one can see clearly the patient should lie supine and one has to tap using your third finger, or one can use the second index finger in the front of the parotids where the facial nerve are exited. So while you tap it, one can see the twitching of the facial muscles. So this is because of the irritability of the facial nerves. Similarly, most of you know how to elicit a Trousseau sign, but for those who is not aware of this, one has to take the blood pressure. So what is the systolic blood pressure? Then you have to inflate the cuff at least 10 millimeter above the systolic blood pressure for at least 3 minutes. So the patient may develop the carpopedal spasm. It is not necessarily the patient will develop at 3 minutes. The patient may develop within the first minute also. So one can see the contraction of the fingers. So what happens when one applies the cuff pressure more than the systolic blood pressure? It leads to a reduction in the blood flow to the muscles, which lead to the irritability of nerve ending, and finally the contraction happens. So these are very two simple bedside maneuvers where one can confirm the patient has hypocalcemia when it is suspected, and one can start the therapy while taking the sample. One not necessarily has to wait for the lab value. So this we discussed. One has to order a calcium and albumin simultaneously, and the corrected calcium should be the one based upon which you should take a decision. This thing may be unreliable in critical illness where one should ideally measure ionized calcium. So when we get a hypocalcemia, then we should also send phosphorus, alkaline phosphatase, PTS, 25 OST, magnesium and creatine along with it. One should remember to send it in the fasting state because the phosphorus has to be done in fasting state and in the morning sample. Fasting, why? Because any meal will increase the serum phosphorus value. Why morning? Because phosphorus has a diurnal rhythm, higher values seen in the morning compared to that in evening. So now, like I discussed, based upon the permutation combination of these values, one can lead to a diagnosis. So what I'll do, I'll go through different scenarios. I will expect to suggest a diagnosis. You can either comment or you can type in the chat box. Anyone? Calcium is low or low normal, low phosphorus, high alkaline phosphatase, and PTH with a normal creatinine and low vitamin D.
Hypoparathyroidism.
So in hypopara, why the PTH is high? It should be low or at max,
Vitamin D
maybe low
deficiency.
normal. Sorry?
Vitamin D
Vitamin D
deficiency.
deficiency.
Okay. In vitamin D
Secondary
deficiency, it will lead to hypocalcemia.
hypothyroidism.
Sorry? Again,
Secondary hyperparathyroidism.
pseudo-hypopara.
No, secondary due to CKD or something.
CKD. But creatine is normal. And in CKD, while one expects a low phosphorus, the phosphorus should be high or at least normal.
Osteomalacia, sir?
Okay, that he mentioned vitamin D deficiency. In vitamin D deficiency, remember that figure? Again, I'm highlighting because that's why I gave some emphasis. Vitamin D deficiency lead to hypocalcemia. That will lead to excess parathyroid hormone secretion. One of the function of parathyroid hormone is it will cause loss of phosphorus in the urine. So there will be hypophosphatemia. So while elevated PTH try to maintain a normal calcium or low normal calcium, right? But it will lead to loss of phosphorus. So a hypophosphatemia is often mentioned one of the earliest biochemical features of vitamin D deficiency. So if you look into this table, phosphorus is low, calcium is low, low normal, alkaline phosphatase will be high, PTH will be high, vitamin D is low. So this is classically a case of vitamin D deficiency. CKD के against में a normal creatine will go against CKD. A high PTH will go against hypopara. Somebody may say, why not pseudo hypopara? In pseudo hypopara, the phosphorus will be again high. A loss of parathyroid hormone or resistance to action of parathyroid hormone will result in low calcium and high phosphorus because parathyroid hormone is responsible for loss of phosphorus in the urine. So if it is gone, so it won't be lost, it will be reabsorbed, so the phosphorus would be high, which is not the case here. So it is vitamin D deficiency. Next,
Hypoparathyroidism.
right. Why not renal failure? In renal failure, you get low calcium, high phosphorus, alkaline phosphatase may be normal.
Creatinine is normal.
Yeah. So creatinine is a must in such panel. This
Pseudo hypoparathyroidism.
absolutely right. May I know your name? Sorry, your name did not get reflected in the screen.
Hasina.
Acha, you are from which department? Nephrology?
Medical genetics, sir.
Okay, great. What about this?
CKD, renal disease.
Yeah, renal osteodystrophy.
Secondary hypoparathyroidism.
So, like we discussed all the approach of management, just to summarize, if you find if the patient is symptomatic or this 1 point reflects to 7.7, especially in an acute setting, not in a chronic setting, so you should give intravenous calcium gluconate. If it is not in a chronic setting, acute setting, and patient is asymptomatic, you should consider oral therapy. So most often the cause is vitamin D deficiency. One should treat with vitamin D, basically cholecalciferol. If the patient has hypoparathyroidism, then you have to also start calcitrol along with the calcium. If it is normal, just cholecalciferol and the calcium. That's all. Am I clear, or should I again mention it, repeat it once? Okay, let me repeat it once. So if the patient is acutely symptomatic, then the patient should receive intravenous calcium gluconate. So how this treatment should be given? There are two ways it can be given. First, one can give a bolus, 10 ml of 10% solution over 10 minutes. It should be followed by a intravenous infusion. One can start with 0.5 milligram or 1 milligram per kg over 24 hours. Simultaneously, you have to give oral calcium and calcitrol if required, so that there is a overlap. So for the long-term treatment, it depends upon the etiology. If it is because of the vitamin D deficiency, one has to give oral calcium along with cholecalciferol or egocalciferol. If it is because of the hypoparathyroidism or pseudohypoparathyroidism, or if there is CKD, the 125 hydroxy D, which is the active form, that will be often deficient. So one has to give the active vitamin D, like calcitriol or alpha calcitriol. If anybody has any doubt, they can discuss at the end of the session. So these things I just mentioned, you can go through the slide. Another thing here I would like to mention, the resident should give a clear instruction to the nursing chart, and one should write that this infusion has to be given slowly over 10 minutes. If you do not write this and you do not say to the nursing staff, and if you observe from a distance, you can see many instances they give it over a period of 2 minutes, 3 minutes, which can be really dangerous for the patient. It can lead to a cardiac asystole. Just it happens with injection phenytoin if it is not given slowly. So one should be very careful and give clear-cut written instruction, and if possible, can supervise the injection if it is permitted. So any questions? Anyone, any doubts, questions? Otherwise, we'll take a couple of minute break and move to few practical case discussions on sodium and potassium imbalances, which discussed yesterday. Okay, meanwhile, if you want, you can type your questions. Now we should discuss couple of scenarios just as a practical experience, but you have to be really proactive in discussing all these things, right?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So this is a 20-year-old boy who had a surgery for the craniopharyngioma 4 days back, and he's still in the neurosurgery ICU, conscious oriented, and the endocrinologist were called for a serum sodium level of 121. So what you will do?
Have to look for urine and serum osmolality.
Oh, before that, anything?
Volume status.
Urine output.
Yes.
Volume overload.
Yeah. First, any hyponatremia, the first thing you have to do, look for the volume status. So say the patient is clinically euvolemic, the JPP is not elevated, mucous membrane is moist, capillary refilling time is 2 seconds, the skin pinch is going back in 1 second. So I'm just telling all the features where you have to carefully look for the volume status, and urine output is adequate. So basically he is euvolemic. What next? Anyone? Come on. It was discussed yesterday only. I'm sure they must have discussed how to approach.
You can look for urine osmolality.
So what do you want to look in the urine osmolality?
Urine sodium.
Sorry? Serum. You mean urine sodium or serum sodium? Hello. Yes, Mayank. Mayank, we are not able
Sir,
to hear
urinary
you.
sodium.
Okay, so what do you want to see in urinary sodium and urinary osmolality? Like we order any investigation, we have certain thing in mind. We analyze, okay, we'll be looking for this thing in the urinary sodium or urinary osmolality. So what you
For
are looking for?
urinary osmolality for looking axon of ADH.
So say urine osmolality is 350 milliosmoles per liter, and urinary sodium is 60 milligram per 24 hours.
Sir, how much is urine sodium?
Milligram for over 24 hours.
If urine osmolality is 350, that means ADH is working.
So can you come to a diagnosis or you need more information?
So there can be a urinary loss of sodium.
Sir, CSW.
CSW. Okay, great. Somebody came to. So what are all other things? So basically this is a euvolemic hyponatremia, right? Hello.
Yes, sir.
So what are the different causes of euvolemic hyponatremia? I missed
One
one
is
point.
SIADH.
Okay, SIDH.
The
Hypothyroidism.
CSW will have hypovolemic.
Okay, hypothyroidism.
Persistent vomiting.
Persistent vomiting. I don't agree with that terminology, but a related terminology I will agree. I'll come to that.
So glucocorticoid
Hypocortisol.
deficiency.
Primary
Sorry,
polydipsia.
primary
Hypocortisol.
polydipsia.
Primary
Okay, we can
polydipsia.
keep that in mind. Somebody was telling something else.
Isolated glucocorticoid deficiency.
Hypocortisol.
Okay. Somebody said thyroid hormone deficiency, glucocorticoid deficiency, right?
Excess IV fluid, hypotonic IV fluid.
Excess IV fluid. How will it cause hyponatremia? Which kind of IV fluids you are considering?
Hypotonic IV fluid.
But really, will it cause hyponatremia? How will it cause? Then you have to understand how kidney handles. If you give excess IV fluid, hypotonic IV fluid, what will the physiological response in the kidney? Similarly, if you take lot of water, say 12 liters water per day, do you think it will lead to hyponatremia? Because our kidneys are meant to deal with all those things physiologically. So usually they do not lead to hyponatremia. I agree with SIADs. I agree with hypothyroidism, adrenal insufficiency. I agree with primary. I don't agree that much with primary polydipsia. Maybe I will say some other condition related to primary polydipsia, not primary. Reset osmostat.
So even sir, hypotonic IV fluid in hospitalized patients because they will have inappropriate ADH secretion. So in that case, they might
No, inappropriate ADS secretion is a different thing. Renal handling is a different thing. They may be interrelated, but in setting where you take a lot of water, you give a lot of hypotonic fluids. If the kidneys are intact, it is highly unlikely it will lead to a hyponatremia. That's what I meant to say. So this is a setting where we can get hypothyroidism. So you have to check the thyroid hormone, and many times they actually supplement it. That's perfectly right. And these patients usually can be checked for the cortisol, and if it is deficient, they should be supplemented. So in absence of hypothyroidism or adrenal insufficiency, or maybe in a case of adult who might have received a especially loop for diuretic, if those conditions are excluded, so then it will fit with a entity just which we mentioned, SIADS, syndrome of inappropriate antidiuretic. Remember, it is a diagnosis of exclusion. So you have to exclude other causes of euvolemic hyponatremia. Somebody mentioned vomiting. Actually, vomiting does not cause hyponatremia. It is an acute nauseating sensation. If that is a situation, or if it is a really acute pain following a fracture, which happens most commonly fracture of shaft of femur, those are two known causes which can lead to excess ADH secretion, which can lead to hyponatremia. So these are the things which can lead to euvolemic hyponatremia. Somebody rightly mentioned cerebral salt wasting. Cerebral salt wasting many times have a volume depleted condition which can be recognized clinically. But unfortunately, most times the patient may look euvolemic. So it may be really difficult to differentiate SIADS from cerebral salt wasting. So in this patient, first of all, the patient is in ICU. So one has to rule out a cause for possible pseudo-hyponatremia, whether the patient has diabetes or not, whether patient has received a mannitol just recently or not. If those things are not there, look for the volume status like euvolemic. You have to, like, you look thyroid, cortisol, all these things. It is not there. Then it might be SIDH or cerebral salt wasting. Then you look for the volume status clinically. Second thing, you have to look for the biochemical parameters which can differentiate between these two. So for SIADH, you require, the diagnosis requires urine sodium because there is natriuresis, urine osmolality, serum sodium, serum creatinine. In addition, also should measure uric acid, blood urine nitrogen, which are markers of a volume depleted condition like cerebral salt wasting. In those conditions, these are expected to be slightly higher compared to SIDs. There is no definite cutoff, so basically it is a clinical decision. Why it is important to make the difference between the CSW and SIDs? Because the management is completely opposite. In SIDs, you try to restrict the fluid blast. Then if it is not responding, you can give oral salt, you can give fluorocortisone, or you can give ephaptans. But the management is completely opposite in cerebral salt wasting, where you have to give fluids, especially isotonic fluids. So it is really important to understand that thing. Another thing, only think about cerebral salt wasting if there is a CNS pathology. It does not happen in a non-CNS pathology, but SIDS can happen in so many other pathology, mostly lung, abdomen. Any more doubts on this question? Anything? So now the second case scenario, it is a very simple one, but we can discuss couple of practical things, laboratory related things.
Fasting cortisol.
Sorry,
Due to adrenal
Addison's
insufficiency.
disease.
sorry, I could not hear you.
Addison's disease.
Addison's disease.
Right away additions, okay. Okay, agree. So how you manage this patient? How you confirm the diagnosis?
Serum free cortisol.
Sorry,
Serum free cortisol at 8 a.m.
actually free cortisol, I really doubt anybody does that. Okay, you do morning cortisol. So basically, I'm not looking for the how you establish diagnosis of Addison's. So the first thing I will suggest, okay, this is a clinical scenario which fitting with a setting for hyperkalemia and hyponatremia. So any patient of hyperkalemia, you should always be careful, especially when the setting is not visible, whether there is a hemolysis or not. So if I will say there is no pigmentation, somebody examined there is no pigmentation, potassium is 5.4, right? So what we will do to find out the etiology? 34-year-old male, fever, weight loss 6 months, No pigmentation. Potassium is 4.4 and sodium is 122.
Aldosterone
How will
deficiency.
approach? Again the same approach. Volume status euvolemic. You have to rule out hypothyroidism and hypocortisolism. So do a T4 and ESH. Do a cortisol. Ask for history of any remote thiazide or loop diuretic use. They might sometimes cause this. If the cortisol is low, then you do a ACTH. That will help you whether it is coming from the adrenal or the pituitary. So I will ask a very theoretical question. Uh, why does a hyponatremia result in patient who has cortisol deficiency? Anyone?
Sir, can you repeat the question?
How adrenal insufficiency can lead to hyponatremia?
So glucocorticoid also has,
Yeah, glucocorticoid also.
they have mineralocorticoid action.
Sorry.
So glucocorticoid, they have partial mineralocorticoid action. So maybe that is.
No, that is not the proper explanation.
It's usually seen in primary adrenal insufficiency where there is mineralocorticoid deficiency also.
Right. So mineralocorticoid usually helps in the retention of sodium and excretion of potassium. So if they are deficient, though it is explained. I agree. So if say it is arises from the hypothalamus pituitary secondary adrenal insufficiency, how will explain the hyponatremia? Or hyponatremia won't happen. Actually, we see very frequently in patients with secondary adrenal insufficiency. Okay, so if I do not get an answer, I can reply to that. It may not be an easy answer. Anyone? Okay, so cortisol also negatively inhibit the ADH. So if there is a deficiency of the cortisol, the ADH will be inappropriately high. So which will lead to retention of the water and hyponatremia. So both the mechanism take place in patients who has primary adrenal insufficiency, but the second mechanism take place in the patient who have secondary. So their mineralocorticoid axis is not involved, so one do not get hyperkalemia. Okay, the patient's cortisol, thyroid is completely normal. There is no diuretic use. So you suspect SIADS. What will do next to find out the etiology? I can change this
For
question
any
into bit more. Say 54-year-old male, fever, weight loss for 6 months.
malignant
Potassium 4.4, sodium 122, cortisol normal, thyroid axis normal, no diuretic use, urinary sodium 50 milligram per 24 hours, urinary osmolality 400 milliequivalent. So what you will do next? So what is the diagnosis then? Euvolemic
SIADH.
hyponatremia. Yes, SIADH. So SIADH may be because of secondary to any pathology lies in the brain, in the lung, in the abdomen, right? So how will work off for a case of SIADS? Because you do not know what is the underlying etiology which is causing SIADS. You look for all the prescription, you did not find any medicine which can cause SIADS. There is certain clue it may be something serious, elderly, male, 6 months history of loss, it may be malignancy, it may be chronic infection, right? So the further workup may include plain X-rays of the chest, ultrasound, to sophisticated investigation like PET-CT. So it is not a very straightforward thing, but one should always try to find out the etiology as far as possible.
So there is nothing much in this. So it's just a 10-year-old child, no previous significant history, and a urine output of 4 liters per day. 4 liters per day. A child had apparently normal growth and development, and height and weight was 135 centimeter and 30 kg respectively. Lab investigation showed serum sodium 148, potassium 3.5, and create 0.6. So just few concepts, nothing much about the case scenario, nothing much about any diagnostic dilemma. It's just about discussing the common concepts. So one of the concepts is the polyuria. Is 4 liter adequate for this child, or it's too much or less? What it is? So polyuria, we have
Too
some
much.
definition. Like for an adult patient, it's roughly around more than 3 liters per day. But for children, it depends upon the weight. So that is more than 50 ml per kg per day. So for a 30 kg old child, it would be like more than 1.5 liter per day. So more than 1.5 liter per day is suggestive of polyuria. And if it's more than 100 ml per kg per day, then it's a significant polyuria. So this child is clearly polyuric, as weight is 30 kg, and its polyuric cutoff would be roughly around 1.5 liter per day. It's more than that. So child is polyuric. Then can you tell me the cause of hypernatremia? Anyone? Why is there hypernatremia in this case?
Free water loss, sir.
Free water loss. Absolutely. So there could be many causes of polyuria. One could be osmotic diuresis, one could be just due to diuresis, and one could be just due to free water loss. So in free water loss, sodium is more likely to rise, and it has raised value. So free water loss is the cause for hypernatremia, and the free water clearance is under the control of ADH. You must be knowing, I am sure. Next, just a brief pathophysiology of water and solute handling. So do you know how much water we require every day? What is the physiology of water requirement and water excretion or water loss from our body? A balance should be maintained. So how much water is lost? Insensible loss and the other losses. So how much is the insensible loss? Can anyone tell me?
500 ml.
Very good. 500 ml per meter square. So roughly for a weight of 30 kg, the body surface area would be 1 meter square, roughly, approx. So we would take it as a 1 meter square body surface area for this child. So a 500 ml would be the insensible loss per day. And then how much is the losses from kidneys? That is they are the two main loss points or water loss mechanisms in our body. So how much is the urine loss?
1 to 1.2 liters per day.
So see, it depends upon how much solute we are excreting every day. So that is roughly about 500 millis. You keep this 500 in your mind. So that was 500 ml per meter square insensible loss, and this is around the urine loss is it's like we have to calculate like 500 milliosmol per meter square. That's how much our body generates. Okay, so for this kg, for this 30 kg or 1 meter square, how much solute load will be there? 500. You got my point? So we have to excrete 500. This child has to excrete 500 milliosmol of solute load. So now it comes to urine concentrating capability. The max capability is 10,000 milliosmol per liter. So if 1000 milliosmol per liter is the maximum capacity and kidney is functioning at its maximum capacity, then to excrete 500 milliosmoles, it would need 0.5 liter of urine output. So this means minimum, if kidney is functioning at its fullest, then minimum 0.5 liter for 500 ml for the solute excretion and 500 ml of the insensible loss. So 1 liter is the minimum water we animal lose per meter square, and that much one has to intake. So now comes what happens in this this case of polyuria. There is no apparent growth and development is normal. There is no medical surgical illness, so looks like a free water loss. It looks like case of DI, diabetes insipidus. Diabetes insipidus means ADH. It's either it's not there in central diabetes insipidus or it's not working. It's not acting at its target organ. That's the case in nephrogenic DI. So in DI, urine concentrating ability is lost. So the minimum ability is 50 milliosmol per liter. So to excrete 500 milliosmol, one would need to, in the minimum capacity, one would need to excrete at least 10 liter of urine, 10 liter of water along with that. So in DI, it's roughly around 50 to 200 milliosmol per liter. That is the limit. More than 200 milliosmol per liter, that capacity does not go beyond that. So a minimum of 3 liter and the maximum of 10 liter one has to excrete, and that much water one has to intake. So how do we work up? Creatinine is normal, potassium is okay. So looks like a case of DI. So can anyone tell how do we work up? How can we establish that it's a case of water deprivation test? We all need not go into the very detail of that. That is not the primary target of this case discussion. I just wanted to know the mechanism and the processes through which the kidney handles the solute. So in a case of DI, non-functioning or non-availability of ADH, the minimum concentrating ability would be 50 milliosmol per liter. So to excrete 500 milliosmol, it would need 10 liter of water to be excreted to clear that solute load. So that much could be the deficit, or even if it works at its best in the case of DI, then the maximum 200 milliosmol per liter. Then to excrete 500 milliosmol, it would need roughly around 2.5 liter of urine. So there is a routine excretion of at least minimum of 2.5 liter through kidney and 0.5 liter through insensible loss. So 3 liter water should be excreted minimum, and max could go up to 10.5 liter. So that much one has to intake, otherwise patient will be in a state of dehydration, and patient may have multiple other complications due to that. So management it will depend upon our water deprivation test, whether it's central or peripheral. It's just that we induce a state of dehydration by doing a water deprivation. Thirst is very high, but we try to limit that water intake in a state of thirst. We don't allow, and when there is thirst, there is less water intake, but kidneys are not able to maintain the urine concentrating ability, not to increase the concentrating ability. So what would happen? Kidney will keep excreting or losing the water. So patient will become dehydrated, his sodium will rise further, his serum osmolality will rise further, it will go more than 300, so sodium will go more than 145 or 150. Then at that point of time we do urine concentration, because if serum osmolality is rising, urinary osmolality should rise. But since kidneys are not able to increase the concentrating ability, so urine osmolality will remain below 200 millismol per liter. Then we give ADH, vasopressin from outside. If that osmolality increases, we think that this is ADH insufficiency. This means it's a central DI, and as a treatment we give Minirin, that DDAVP. If it's not rising, if it's still not rising, then it means that ADH is there but maybe not functioning. So could be a case of nephrogenic DI. Then we have other options also like Vaptans and hydrochlorothiazide. So no need to this memorize all these things of DI, central DI, and this nephrogenic DI. You just have to keep in mind how kidneys retain or excrete or handle the solute and the water. Is that part of this case was clear? The renal handling of solute. That is the only thing I wanted you to know from this case. So now this is a case of a child with bilateral lower limb deformity, and we don't have much time, so we will go very fast. And a hypokalemia. So hypokalemia with lower limb deformity. Can anyone answer what this could be?
Renal tubular acidosis.
It's a case of rickets with hypokalemia. So what all could be the causes apart from, we still don't know there is acidosis or not.
So it can be CKD also.
It can be a
Chronic kidney disease.
You said something, please repeat it.
Renal rickets.
Okay, very good. So how to proceed?
So if there is any diarrhea history, losses from diarrhea.
So can we do a VBG or ABG for this?
VBG, urine output monitoring. Great.
Yeah, urine output is one important thing, because in RTA there will be polyuria. Agree? And then we can get a creatinine level that would
to check for renal losses of potassium, we have to do transtubular potassium gradients.
Yeah, we would come to that. I am saying that this rickets and hypokalemia, what could be the possibility? One possibility is RTA. Second possibility could be renal rickets, like maybe in a case of chronic renal failure. Although potassium level may vary and they tend to be on the higher side, but these kind of pictures can be seen. So one thing could be the renal, CRF related, this renal rickets, osteodystrophy, and third possibility could it be Bartter syndrome? Okay, so no issue. We would just do a creatinine. A normal creatinine would rule out CRF, and then we would do a VBG. On VBG, acidosis. If acidosis is evident, and what kind of acidosis will be there in this case? Metabolic. What kind of metabolic acidosis?
Normal and
Normal anion gap. Okay, and you can see high chloride also, hyperchloremic. So hyperchloremic normal anion gap metabolic acidosis would rule in favor of RTA. So further investigations we have done, management would depend upon the cause. Like if it's RTA, we have to provide the alkali. So basically this is the algorithm what we do. So basically we do urine potassium. If urine potassium is less than 15 millimole per day, this means it's not a primary or predominantly renal loss. It's mainly extra renal loss, or could be some remote renal loss possibility. So we do acid base status. If it's a metabolic acidosis, most likely GI loss, and if it's alkalosis, then could be maybe long standing diuretic use, kidney would have compensated for many things and some remote possibility. But basically, it's a case of either GI loss or profuse sweating, maybe like a case of cystic fibrosis. If it's more than 15 millimoles per liter, then this means it's a renal loss. Then we do TTKG. You know what is TTKG?
Transtubular potassium.
Transtubular
Potassium gradient.
Potassium
So
gradient.
basically it's a urinary potassium into serum osmolality by serum potassium into urine osmolality. So in a state of hyperkalemia, it should not be more than 12, and in a state of hypokalemia, it should not be less than 4. I think first part I told wrong. It should be more than 12, and in a case of hypokalemia, it should be more than 4. So if suppose TTKG comes as less than 4, this means basically there is a problem of renal handling. Then how to proceed? So now it's basically evident as a renal loss. So now we have so many possibilities. Can anyone tell how to proceed by a simple test? What is the most important test at this juncture? You know it's a TTKG. TTKG is low, and we know it's a primarily it's a renal loss. So what is the most important test at this point?